What up, YouTube? This is your boy, Adam of NOLA, and today we're doing a response video. But first, I'm going to throw out some disclaimers. When I've done response videos in the past, it's usually something of a teardown, because sometimes you find these videos that are just the YouTube equivalent of excrement, and you feel like, man, I have to say something about this. This isn't that kind of video. The creator that I'm going to highlight and his content is not something that I normally think is devoid of worth. In fact, I wanted to do this response video because, to be quite frank, I'm kind of disappointed with this creator. The creator is Gavin Ortland. If you've done any traipsing around YouTube in Christian apologist circles, you've probably come across some of his videos at least. And I say I'm disappointed because of all the Christian apologists that I've run into so far on YouTube, he is hands down usually the one that I find to be the most listenable from a skeptic's perspective. Now, to be clear, I don't say that because he and I share any theological views. We're probably polar opposites in that regard, as you would expect, since I'm an atheist and he's a Christian apologist. But so much of Christian apologist content just comes down, in my humble opinion, to snarky takes with little thought, little backing in reason or logic or scholarly discipline, and they're just performative for their own base. And while I don't agree with many of Gavin's takes, because he's a Christian apologist, he, unlike so many of the other apologist content creators, in my humble opinion, normally comes across as being much more respectful of all viewpoints, much more thoughtful and humble about constantly assessing his own worldview. And you can tell that he's thinking through things, or that he's given a lot of thought to things before he just turns on a camera and turns on a mic and starts spewing invective at someone. He does a really good job, usually, at what he calls steelmanning. Well, that's not his term, but, steelmanning his opponents or other person's views. So rather than strawmanning, which is a really weak and lazy intellectual tactic or lack of intellect, instead he'll try to steelman other views. He tries to think from the perspective of others. He's not exclusionary in his doctrines and his dogmas. So in other words, while he may have strong opinions, for example, about what it takes to be saved, he doesn't talk dismissively about Catholics. He doesn't talk dismissively about other religions. He doesn't even normally talk dismissively about agnostics or atheists. So that's why I was so disappointed and so let down when I saw this video. And it's not just the title, but the title is Atheism is Devastating and Unlivable. Now, to be absolutely clear, do I expect Gavin Ortland, or any Christian apologist for that matter, to ever put out a video extolling the virtues of atheism? Of course not. Obviously, he's not going to be in favor of atheism, and I don't expect him to do a video where he talks glowingly about atheism or agnosticism or any of these related ideas. But the title alone betrays the lack of balance that he's about to put into this video. Atheism is devastating and unlivable. Like, really? I'm not devastated, and I'm living quite well. But it gets worse from the title, and we'll dive in. I will mention one last disclaimer here really quickly. When I say that I'm disappointed in Gavin, trust me, he has no freaking clue who I am. I am this tiny YouTube creator with a tiny channel, an atheist channel. Of course, he's never heard of me. I'm sure he's never seen one of my videos. I'm sure he doesn't care if I'm disappointed or not. This isn't meant as some personal admonishment of him, because he doesn't even know who I am. He doesn't have any need to even think about my opinions on these matters at all. But I just bring up my disappointment because I really feel like someone like Gavin can and should have done better. So let's get into this video and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Okay, let's start with this question. What does atheism mean for the meaning of life? And of course, we're not the first people to ask this question, so we want to consider history and how others have thought about this. We'd be foolish not to consider how others who have preceded us have wrestled with this question. And probably the biggest effort to locate meaning in a world without God is represented by atheistic existentialist philosophy. Existentialism is a philosophical movement. Of course, not all existentialists are. It's a broad movement. But I say atheistic existentialism. I think this set of theories and instincts in philosophy captures the emotions of atheism, what it feels like to make this tilt or adjustment to life without God, which has happened so much in the modern era. You could sum it up with this core intuition from Jean-Paul Sartre and his famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence." Again, I know in the academic literature, this is sometimes not favored as a way to get into it, but at the popular level, it gets us into the question. This little slogan helps us. It's a good starting point. Essentially, it means that life has no model or blueprint. Okay, there's no ultimate plan. There's no essence. We simply are, or that's existence. So we are free to construct our own meaning and purpose. Put it like this: there is nothing.
So the first thing I want to point out here is that, like so many apologists do, Christian apologists, he attacks the question purely from a Christian perspective. And admittedly, since I live in the American South, a lot of times I am looking at things from the opposite of the Christian perspective. But atheism is not the opposite of Christianity. Atheism is the opposite of theism. Why do I bring that up? Well, when he talks about meaning, he's inferring that there is this construct which is given to us all by his idea of a Christian God. But I want to point out that you can be theistic or deistic and not believe that there is meaning thrust upon you by your God. Now, I understand that in the Christian mindset, many Christians that I've known, and I'm sure Gavin is probably one of them, believe sincerely that their Christianity does provide some kind of meaning for their life. And if you get meaning from that, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But there's going to be a common theme in this video, which is this idea that you can only get meaning from not just theism, but really from the idea of a Christian God. See, I bring this up because, for example, although it's not a very popular opinion in the world, there are deists who absolutely believe in a God, but they don't believe that the God is actually interfering or running our lives. They would not be atheists at all, and yet they would still have some of the same challenges that he's about to get into here with this idea of a lack of meaning. Because if you think that meaning is somehow tied to your belief in God, the generic God, then what do you do if your God that you believe in is a deistic God, meaning one that does not interfere in the lives of humans, one that does not actively tinker with the universe? For that matter, there are other religious paradigms where the gods or God do not take as active of a role in our everyday lives. So my point here is very simple. The idea that theism gives you meaning and atheism gives you no meaning is a ridiculously simple false dichotomy. And quite frankly, Gavin should know that. But I feel like this is one area where he's already getting into this oversimplification.
Thing that the world, or you or I, are supposed to be. We simply are. Now, that doesn't feel terrifying yet from introducing it like that. I think it probably will as we go. Sartre saw this as the result of atheism. That's why I call this the emotions of atheism. He said existentialism is nothing else but an attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheistic position. To explain why, he appealed to this famous slogan from the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, from whom we will be drawing a lot in this video, that if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. We're going to come back to that statement a couple of times in this.
So, of course, I hear this all the time from theists, specifically, obviously, Christians. This idea that if God did not exist, there are no rules. You can do whatever you want. It's a free-for-all, which is just patently ridiculous. The idea that I can do whatever I want and everything is permitted makes no logical sense. The fact that I'm an atheist doesn't somehow give me permission to do anything. Now, yes, you can say, well, if you do a bad thing, you're not going to rot in hell. No, if I do a bad thing, I'm going to have to live with those consequences for the rest of my life. That is a real consequence. We all only have so much time on this earth. And the idea that you would spend any of it consciously or even accidentally hurting others or doing things that are antithetical to the human condition is sad and wrong for most people. Yes, there's always going to be some shred of the population that will do bad stuff. And newsflash, those aren't all atheists. In fact, a lot of them will tell you that they're Christians or that they're theists of some sort. So the idea that it's the atheist doing the bad things because, hey, everything's permitted is really weak. Now, he's pulling this from Dostoevsky, which is a titan of literature, but there's a danger in extrapolating too far from this. And that's exactly what Gavin does.
Video and see if that, number one, is that even in Dostoevsky? Yes, it is. Number two, is that a fair statement? My general view from the cheap seats looking at things is that it seems like in the 21st century, atheists have moved away from the mentality of a Sartre or other existentialists, from Nietzsche and other, that statement from Dostoevsky that all these earlier philosophers have appealed to, and they've got a much more buoyant, optimistic form of atheism. And the big question is, well, did they just get beyond this silly version of atheism, or was that the more honest one? The new atheists and the old atheists, Sam Harris and Friedrich Nietzsche. Who's the more consistent atheist? What's the more consistent outlook? That's what we're getting into.
So he does make several references in this video to this idea of new atheism and old atheism. And he's trying to make this case that the old atheists are more consistent. I am not a philosopher. Maybe there are philosophical consistencies in old atheism that you don't see in the so-called new atheists. But when it comes to meaning, that is much more of an experiential factor than it is for philosophy. What I'm getting at is this. If the old atheists, you think, had a more consistent position and they were all miserable 100 years ago or whatever, and these new atheists today say, no, that's not how you have to live if you're an atheist, and we have a lot of meaning and we're happy and we have good lives. And you're going to tell me then that the old atheists are the ones that are more consistent. I mean, maybe they're more consistent in your master's level philosophy quiz or thesis or whatever, but the proof is in the pudding here. If you can find a significant population of atheists who will tell you all day that they have meaning in their life and that they're happy and they're not devastated and unlivable, then are you going to keep pointing back to people like Nietzsche and telling me, no, but Nietzsche said this, or Sartre said this? Like, what does any of that have to do with it? This isn't their life we're talking about. It's my life. So there's a bit of arrogance here in trying to tell the world now that this miserable condition of atheism is the right one or the more consistent one, if you can look around you and see atheists in abundance who aren't actually proving any of those miserable predictions out. I will also say, we'll see as the video goes on, that one of the things that really disappoints me about this analysis is that he doesn't seem to want to make any distinction between atheism and nihilism, which are not the same things at all. Of course, there are nihilists who are atheists, but there are many atheists who are not nihilists. Or there are atheists who have been nihilistic and have come out of that almost like it was a phase. Now, that's not everyone, but the point is that a lot of what he's talking about isn't atheism or existentialism, but it's nihilism. And he's mixing up these concepts haphazardly. And I know that he knows better, which is why I say I'm disappointed in this analysis, because he knows the differences between nihilism and existentialism and atheism. And while they may have some similarities on a Venn diagram, the idea that one equates to the other, which equates to the other, is very fallacious. And I see these kind of weak, lazy associations being made with apologists that I think are of a much lower caliber than Gavin Ortland.
Now, Sartre talks about this. He says, starting in the 1880s, French philosophers who were atheists developed a secular morality, disposing of God, but maintaining kind of traditional moral values and basically saying you can just leave off God and keep the same basic moral vision.
This is what I would call secular humanism.
And Sartre rejected that, saying, without God, there is no objective value for goodness that exists outside of us, to which we must correspond in any meaningful sense. Therefore, the existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. This might seem like a drastic conclusion, and we'll register some objections to it, but just looking at the face of it, it kind of makes sense. If there's no creator who assigned the world a meaning, where else would it come from?
So I literally just published recently, I think it was yesterday, a video talking about this myth. And it is a myth of the idea that theism in general, or Christianity specifically, has any type of objective morality. Now, I'm not telling you that Christians are all immoral or that they're all amoral. I'm telling you that there are a lot of Christians that have great morality, but it's not because of some magically imbued objective morality that comes from their religion or their God. I go into that in detail in this other video. I'm not going to do another side note on that here, but the idea that objective morality has to be tied to a God is false. And furthermore, the idea that the Christian God is a source of objective morality is also false. But moving on.
It's hard to see where you'd get a plan for the world without someone doing the planning, So you can see why people would experience the loss of God to be devastating like this. Think of a simple metaphor. So I like doing puzzles with my kids. Puzzles are fun because they have a meaning. The pieces are meant to fit together. Someone built a puzzle by constructing a picture and then chopping it up into pieces, putting the pieces in a box, putting the picture on the cover of the box, and now you can, you're working on the puzzle and you can sort of gradually discover a coherent meaning piece by piece. Puzzles have a meaning because they have a creator like that. But imagine if you're doing a puzzle and there's no picture on the box, there's no guiding image, there's no intended outcome. And as you start to do it, none of the pieces actually fit. You have to try to jam them together. It's up to you to figure out what picture do you make out of these puzzles and how do you force them to fit together. That is what Sartre is saying human life is like.
So this is one of the worst analogies that I've heard in ages. What Gavin has just described is called art. When you have a bunch of pieces that don't necessarily fit together, or you don't know how they're supposed to fit together, and you have to figure it out for yourself, or you have to make your own way that they fit together, there's a word for that. It's called art. It's called being creative. And newsflash, this can be a glorious process. It can be affirming. When I sit down, because I am an artist, and I start to make a painting, I don't have a plan. I don't have a box cover that shows me what this has to be. I don't have some overlying theme that tells me what I have to make. I just make my art. A lot of what he's talking about here seems to be, to me, that he is swapping out haphazardly this idea of meaning with structure, and they're not the same thing. Some people truly need a lot of structure in their lives, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you are the kind of person who needs to be in a structured environment in order to thrive and feel safe and productive and feel like, your life is going well, then that's fine. Seek out these structured environments. And I would be the first one to tell you, even as an atheist, that one of the key benefits that people often get from religion is this sense of community and this sense of structure. Like, hey, every Sunday I go to church. It's part of this structure. And even if I'm not feeling like it so much today, I just know that if I don't go, I'll feel worse than if I do. These are the types of ideas that come up when someone longs for structure. And again, there's nothing wrong with wanting structure. There's nothing wrong with doing a puzzle, like he's saying, where the picture is already made. The cuts and everything were already done by a machine before it ever got in your house. Now, all you're doing is taking and putting it back together in a structure not a plan, but a structure that was already designed by someone at the factory months or years ago. If that's what you want, that's fine. But don't make it sound like you have to be a Christian to get structure, or that you have to be a theist to get structure. Now, admittedly, again, religion can be a great place to find structure in your life, but it's not the only place that you can find structure if that's what you need. But the idea that it would be so horrible to have to put things together or have to make something without some overarching plan, just on one level makes me want to laugh, and on the other level it makes me sad, because it makes me feel like people in this mindset, I'm not saying he has any problems, but I feel like people in this mindset are missing out on so much, because there's so much to get from life. There's so much meaning to find from life. Sometimes when you are allowed to find your own plan or create your own structure. And if you don't want to do that, if you want to be in a pre-existing structured environment, then do that. Seek that out if that's what feeds your proclivities. But there is such a rich life to be had if you don't feel like you have to be putting together the pieces exactly the way that they were handed to you by some all-knowing God.
Existence comes first. There is no divine plan or human nature to conform to. We're just hurled into the world, and we have the burden of inventing our own meaning. That is what he sees as the logical follow-through and sort of the emotional implication of atheism. And I'm curious if it disturbs you as much as it disturbs me. I mean,
it does not. It does not disturb me at all. And to be clear, if it disturbs you and if it makes you happy to believe in this God, then do it. I don't have a problem with that. But the idea that my life as an atheist would be devastated and unlivable because I am not that same kind of person is, quite frankly, patently absurd.
Just, really think this through. Your relationships, your goals, your suffering, the deepest things, the most important things in your life, they don't have any kind of coherent unity. There's no overarching plan or design. It's just puzzle pieces that don't fit, and you've got to sort of invent your own meaning as you go. For me, I experience that as devastating. Now, some people will say, but that's not what atheism means. Well, let's keep going and see how others have teased this out. Here's another existentialist philosopher, my personal favorite, Albert Camus, another French thinker. He used the word absurd to describe the human condition without God. And essentially what he's saying is, this is a technical term, absurdity, in his philosophy. And essentially what he's saying is the human heart and reality are mismatched. They're like two puzzle pieces that don't fit. So the human heart longs for meaning, but we live in a world that has no meaning, ultimately. We long for coherence against a backdrop of randomness. We thirst for life and happiness, but death and extinction is inevitable. Basically, the fundamental longings of the human heart don't actually correspond to anything outside of us. And the important point to see here is that life is not just absurd for Camus because it's painful or there's suffering or something like that. Suffering you can deal with. By the way, I've discovered this is true. You can deal with suffering if it means something. Young men, for example, it's amazing what you can go through, but you need a meaning, something to organize your life. I think the reason a lot of young men and young women as well struggle with depression is they don't have meaning. It's not that life is hard. It's that there's nothing transcendent to organize it. And this is what Camus is saying. He's saying life is absurd, not because it's hard, but because it's just unintelligible. It doesn't mean anything.
So another thing that he's going to touch on a few times in this video, which I know that he doesn't mean it this way, but it's kind of disturbing to me, is that he equates meaning with happiness. He equates meaning with mental health. He's talking about how these young people sometimes feel lost. They feel depressed because they don't have meaning. Now, again, that's not all people. It's not all young people. But are there young people who feel depressed because they are trying to find some meaning in life? Sure, of course there are. But sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, those people have a lot of other complex things going on. They might have an unsettled home life. They might have difficulty in their relationships, but also they might have clinical depression, or they might have other mental health issues that require attention. And I'm sure that Gavin would not refute that, but I do feel he's playing a little fast and loose here with these ideas that, well, these young people, they don't have meaning. And that's why atheism is so horrible. Even when he talks about this philosopher saying that these things are absurd, he says that this is a technical term, and I don't think he does a really good job of explaining what's meant by that. When that philosopher is saying absurd, he's not talking about absurdity like, well, that's stupid, or I can't believe someone did that. He's saying absurd like he feels there is this mismatch in life. But again, that doesn't mean that everyone feels that mismatch. And if you feel that mismatch, it doesn't necessarily mean that the answer to make you feel better is someone in the sky that we can't touch, we can't hear from, we can't feel, we can't confirm, and that you'll never get a direct answer from. For some Christians, it is. But the idea that that solves the problem is incredibly simplistic.
One image that he uses that's quite vivid in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, is you're on a journey, but you didn't have a starting point and there's no destination at all. Think of it as you're wandering, but there's no Garden of Eden behind you or no promised land before you. It's just wandering. I'll put up on the screen this passage and you can see how he's using this image. Reality itself is a stranger. And he even says we're strangers to ourselves. It's quite provocative. Now,
I don't want to be too trite here, but he keeps bringing up these analogies. And quite frankly, I think a lot of the analogies really miss the mark. So when he talks about wandering, he describes it, and he's using this philosopher's words, but he describes it in a way that makes it sound, you're lost, you're desperate, you don't know what's going on. The other way to look at this is all who wander are not lost. And wandering is not always, in fact, I would argue it's not even usually some sign of despair. It's not some sign of a deeper problem in your life. Sometimes wandering is its own reward. When I go on vacation, especially if it's to someplace I've never been, especially if it's in another country, one of the favorite activities that I like to engage in is just to wander. When I get out of the hotel, I might have a general idea of where I'm going, but I don't like to say, okay, now I have it on this plan, this agenda, that we have to be here for this show, and then we have to have dinner over here, and then tomorrow we're going to wake up at this time, and we're going to be at this place for this tour. That drives me nuts. What I greatly prefer is to get to some place like Rome or Chennai or London and just wander. And the things that you find when you allow yourself to wander can be glorious and enriching.
The key to see with Camus is it's not just the loss of meaning here, it's also our sense of helplessness in the inevitability of death. Death is absolutely inescapable, and therefore whatever you accomplish in this life, it won't have any permanent ongoing consequence. Eventually, your life and any consequence from your life will just run out, and all human civilization will fade away eventually. You just wait around long enough, and therefore there's no lasting results from the entire human story ultimately. And for many people in the modern world, these two challenges, the loss of meaning and the inevitability of death, raise this question of, is life even worth living to begin with? If you really think it through, again, I think the challenge here is really facing it.
So to be fair to Gavin, I've said before, and I will say it again, that the fear of death is one of the major factors that drives people to religion and keeps people in religion. Because for many people, they would rather have a fairy tale than even address the idea that maybe when I die, it ends. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that. For a lot of people, that can be disturbing. It can even be terrifying. It should be terrifying on some level. I don't mean you should walk around all day in this horrible existential fear of death, but it should be terrifying because otherwise, if we didn't have a fear of death, we never even would have gotten here as a species, because every species that's going to survive and thrive needs to, on some level, not want to die. They want to continue going on, and that makes it always more likely that they will pass on their genetic material to the next generation. If you didn't care at all about dying, we wouldn't even be here today. That being said, there are two significant ways to look at this. And I'm not going to imagine that me saying this to you now is going to do anything to flip your mind if you have that kind of existential dread. If you are in that camp and it's a large camp, that's fine. And I'm not going to say anything. I won't be able to say anything to change your mind, but just consider this. In my way of thinking, and I don't speak for all atheists, but in my way of thinking, knowing that this life is so short, it's finite, and I only have so many days. I don't even know how many they are, but I know that whatever the number is, they're ticking away. Every day is another day gone. To me, that fills me with so much more purpose. Because I can't sit here and say, you know what, in heaven, everything's going to be great. And I'm going to see these people that I didn't patch up relationships with in heaven. And I am going to learn to play this instrument that I couldn't take the time to learn when I was on earth because I'll be in heaven. And I know this doesn't apply to everyone. It doesn't apply to all atheists, okay? But to me, that imbues life with so much meaning and so much urgency, not a desperate urgency like, oh my gosh, I'm panicking every day, but this beautiful urgency. Like I could sit here on the couch and eat a couple bags of popcorn and watch reruns that I've already watched 3 times before, or I could do something that's fulfilling to me. And quite frankly, making these videos is fulfilling to me. But I could paint. I could explore new areas of the city that I live in. I could meet new people. There is so much in life that is out there for you to seize. And the idea that you have an eternity waiting for you whenever you die, I believe strongly, only serves to sap the urgency from the life that you have in front of you right now.
Because as Pascal observed, we use diversions so we don't have to deal with these ultimate questions. But if you really slow down and think it through, why is life worth living if it has no ultimate meaning or lasting consequence? The Russian writer Leo Tolstoy described being haunted by this question, even to the point of suicide. And I'll put up this passage on the screen. You can read it through if you want to read it. He's talking about himself around the age of 50, getting to this point. And the question I put in bold in here at the very end is quite simple and poignant. Is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? And that might seem morbid, but if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If life is truly meaningless, then why is it even worth embracing in the first place? And that question, the same question of is life worth living, the question of suicide is what Camus is wrestling with.
Again, I don't want to act like I speak for all atheists, but I can tell you what the answer to that is for me. The meaning of life is to always live in the moment. For me, there is no future and there is no past. They are all mental constructs of me trying to cope with what I perceive to be my future and what I remember of my past. But the simple fact is that this is my life. Now, at the moment that making YouTube videos doesn't feed me anymore, I need to stop. But as long as it is enriching me and hopefully to some extent enriching others, that to me is a huge meaning of life. It's not the only meaning. I'm not trying to tell you that, oh, give up God because the meaning of life is make a YouTube channel. No, I'm saying you need to find what brings meaning and enrichment to your life. And it's not going to be one thing for most people. It's going to be multiple things. It's going to be that partnership, that spouse or that loving person in your life. It's going to be your kids. It's going to be maybe your job, although that can get really sticky. It's going to be the hobbies and extracurricular activities, if you will, that provide happiness in your life. It's going to be the connections you make with people. Even that old guy sitting at the bar who didn't seem to want to talk to anyone, and you had a 30-minute conversation with them. That may feel fleeting. It may feel like there was no point of it. But to me, it was imbued with meaning. Now, everyone else may not believe that, and maybe that description feels lacking to you. And if it does, that's okay. But don't tell me that I don't have meaning just because my definition of my meaning doesn't track to your idea of this glorious eternal afterlife.
The very first sentence of the myth of Sisyphus says there's really one philosophical issue, and that's whether to commit suicide. Okay? Now, he rejects that option. And he says instead he calls for a kind of noble revolt in which we refuse to lapse into nihilism, The universe around us is silent and uncaring. He has one passage where he talks about opening yourself to the gentle indifference of the world. Think of a surgeon operating on you and he just does not care. It's a robot. He does not care. Okay, that's the world around. But Camus says we can choose to embrace the struggle of life nonetheless, and he finds his inspiration in this Greek character, or this character from Greek mythology, I should say, Sisyphus. Some of you will have heard of this story. Sisyphus was bound to roll a boulder up a hill repeatedly and then have it fall down before it gets to the top each time. And he sees Sisyphus as a model. I won't read you this passage, which is at the very, this is how the whole book ends, but he basically says that this is enough and this is our journey and it's okay, we can embrace this. And he even concludes the whole book by saying, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now, after the bleak picture that he's painted throughout the book, this final paragraph is surprisingly positive. I would encourage everyone watching this, if you're interested in these things, read through the myth of Sisyphus. It's easy to read. It's very well written. It has wonderful literary quality to it. It's quite provocative and pungent. But when you get to this passage at the very end, it is a little jarring because he has Sisyphus here concluding that all is well. He's struggling up the mountain in happiness. And you say, wait a second, hold on. Is that really right? I mean, here's the thought experiment. Imagine that you're Sisyphus and you're rolling the boulder up the mountain. You're halfway there. Okay, it takes enormous energy to move this boulder up the mountain. You still have so far to go. Finally, you're near the top, you're exhausted, and then the horrible moment comes where at the last moment, the boulder lurches out of your grasp, slips away, picks up speed as it hurtles back down the mountain, okay? And you're looking at it go, and the thought dawns on you, how long do I look before I go and start over again? When I get to the bottom, how long do I rest before I start over again? And then this dreadful thought, I'll never get out of this situation. This is it. I'm going to be doing this over and over and over and over. And Camus is saying that's life.
Once again, I despise the analogies that Gavin's using here. And to be fair, I know that this is not directly Gavin's analogy because he's referencing an analogy that was given to him from this philosophy book. But it's also his analogy now too, because he's trying to use it to make this point. I haven't read this book, but I think that this is a horrible analogy and it has nothing to do with atheism. Here's why. I guess that maybe in some twisted sort of way, maybe you can make some case of Sisyphus not being miserable. But to me, what makes Sisyphus miserable is not that he has to push a boulder his whole life, because you can argue, well, that's life, is struggle. It's always pushing against something. Okay, fine. I get where maybe you want to invoke Sisyphus at that point, but that's as far as it goes. Because the problem with Sisyphus is that he literally never makes any lasting progress. Every time he gets the boulder almost to the top of the hill, it rolls back down and he has to start over again, and it never gets any better. He never makes any progress. Now, there may be points in your life when you feel like Sisyphus. Maybe you're going to work every day in a dead-end job and that feels miserable. But from a secular humanist perspective, there is progress being made, maybe not in your dead-end job, but there are plenty of opportunities in our life to see progress being made. So yes, you might be pushing your whole life. You might be struggling, but it's not just so that the boulder comes back and you've made no progress. It's so that all of us collectively are moving forward. At the extreme end of this example, you could say like Einstein didn't just struggle with his equations and his experiments for his whole life for no reason. No, it pushed all of us forward. And I know that not all of us can be Einstein, right? Not all of us are moving forward the corpus of human knowledge. But even on a smaller level, you can be doing things in your day that absolutely have lasting effects. And almost every human inherently understands this already, because this is how most people treat the act of raising children. Yes, you struggle every day. You have to take care of them all the time, especially when they're young. You have to make their meals and you have to watch after them, and you have to give up so much of your time that you would have to yourself if you hadn't had kids. And even when they get older, they're going to come and ask you for money, and they're going to want to move back into the house, and they're going to want to go to college, and they're going to need help with that. And they're going to ask if they can borrow the car. And then Joey's going to acquire a drug problem, and that's going to be a horrible ordeal for you for 5 or 10 years while you try to get him out of that and you deal with all that pain and suffering. But the reason that we do this is not because, like Sisyphus, the boulder is just rolling back and we're making no progress at all. Inherently, most humans see our children themselves as being progress, as being legacy. Now, to be clear, I think that people take this too far sometimes. And I think that there are many things that you can do in life that are absolutely overflowing with meaning, not just for you now at this moment, but for all humanity off into the future, that don't have to do with raising kids. But even if you can't find anything else in your life that reaches that kind of bar, this is probably a big part of the reason why you've raised or are raising or want to raise kids. Because it's this idea that you're not just pushing the boulder up the hill and watching it roll right back down and making no progress, that we collectively move forward, and that you have a stake in that, in what you produce, the people that you touch, the children that you raise, any other impact on this world. It's not for naught. Now, again, I understand some people can get into a nihilistic view, which is not atheism. They're not the same thing. But you can get into a nihilistic view and you can start thinking like, well, none of this has any meaning. And if you do, that's a whole different conversation, okay? But atheism does not have to be that at all. And I would argue that the majority of times it is not.
That is life without God. That is life in this absurd condition where we are divorced from our setting, where we long for that which just isn't there. And it's just hard for me to see how Sisyphus can be happy in that circumstance. Camus says that he can embrace the universe as neither sterile nor futile. That's part of that last quote I just put up. Okay, I don't understand that. Futility seems to be the whole point of the very story. That's like why we have this story in our mythology as an image of futility.
Exactly, which is why I think that invoking the imagery of Sisyphus in this scenario is a horrible example.
So, but why can't we just banish this way of thinking to the philosophy classroom? And what I want to suggest is the challenges involved in the loss of God are not so easy to toss to the side. As Western civilization has grown more secular, these existentialist questions about meaning have not gone away. In some ways, you might say they've metastasized. One of my academic interests is the relation of...
So this is another reason why I wanted to address this video, because he, I feel, is very much falling into this same old tired Christian trap where he talks about these horrific, supposedly, consequences of an atheistic mindset. But he never, I don't think in this entire video, acknowledges that you can't just decide, well, atheism is miserable, which isn't true, but let's just for the sake of argument say it is. Atheism is miserable. Fine. And then say, see, this is why you need Christ. This is why you need God. That doesn't work. Because if I'm an atheist, it's because I don't believe in your gods. And telling me that the answer to me getting out of my funk is to then try to force my brain to believe something that it does not believe is not an answer at all. It is an anti-solution. It'd be one thing if I told you, you know, I've been kind of atheist, but I'm starting to think that maybe something's up there and I'm still not sure. And I'm just, you know, trying to figure out. I mean, in other words, if I had expressed to you this idea that I'm kind of atheistic now, but I'm questioning, or I'm thinking that I might be wrong, then clearly that would be someone who is open to the idea of maybe God is something I should embrace, and maybe I would be likely to believe it. But for a lot of atheists, myself included, it wouldn't matter if I was laying prone on the couch every day and could not get up because I was so cripplingly depressed. The answer is never going to be Jeebus, because that would be no different than you being devastatingly depressed, almost unable to move on the couch, and I came to you and said the answer is the flying spaghetti monster. All you have to do is embrace the flying spaghetti monster, and by gummit, you'll be happy. That's not going to do anything. So keep that in mind as he talks, because even if we agreed with some of these bad takes that he has on atheism, it doesn't then present any kind of solution to getting out of that funk by embracing something you don't believe in. What's really happening is, I hate to say this in such a malicious way or to infer this maliciousness on his part, but what he's really doing is just poisoning the well for anyone who's Christian, but really starting to have doubts. And they're thinking, this doesn't make sense. But they haven't given up their faith. They're still on the fence. They're not sure what to do. Maybe they haven't even told anyone out loud that they have doubts, but they're just wrestling with this inside. And when you watch a video like this has a tendency to just scare people back. It's like, ooh, but do you see what else is out there? Like, if you're not Christian, you will be unlivable and devastated. And that's why you can't even allow yourself to think critically about these things at all. So ultimately, it's a scare tactic. Even though Gavin's demeanor is very comforting and he doesn't come across at all as attacking atheists, he doesn't come across as using demagoguery, and he's not using fire and brimstone to try to scare you straight, but he is subtly trying to scare you straight.
But another pattern I've observed with young men especially is that the traditional midlife crisis seems to be hitting earlier for some people. And I think a lot of young men right now, and young women as well, are just wrestling just right out of the bat with these questions in their 20s, especially in their 30s, as you progress in your career. And this big question lands, what is this all for? I will say,
I do believe that to some extent, this whole idea of this existential crisis is a bit of pop psychology. And that's not meant as a dig against Gavin. People since the dawn of the industrial age have been writing about this supposed lack of meaning, this midlife crisis, this sense of what is it all for. But the implication here is that no one in medieval times had such a crisis. Do you really think that the sharecropper working under his feudal lord never felt the same issues as he's struggling in a back-breaking labor of the day? I don't think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is, while I don't deny that there are people having quote-unquote midlife crises, I don't deny that there are people wondering what's the point of all this. I do think that there is very little correlation between the people who are wondering that and atheists. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure that there are some atheists who struggle with these types of questions. I am also absolutely certain that there are many Christians who struggle with the same questions. The idea, for example, of a midlife crisis is not something that you solve or that you avoid by simply being a Christian. It's not like being a Christian is your sunscreen that keeps the midlife crisis from hitting your skin. No, midlife crises and other deeper quandaries about the meaning of life are not something that Christians just don't have to worry about. Christians have the same problems. So my point is, I don't know how much talking about this has to do with any deeper discussion of atheism, because I don't have numbers to put in front of you right now, but I'm pretty certain that for every atheist you find me who is dealing with depression, is dealing with a midlife crisis, is dealing with crushing thoughts of existentialism and lack of meaning, I'm pretty sure that for every one of those, I can find you 2 or 3 or 4 Christians that are going through the exact same thing.
And the question here is, what is there to ground such an ultimate meaning and a religious sense of awe without God? This particular article goes through 4 challenges that have to be overcome, and to my mind, he's correct in showing that God is an essential part of what provides a sense of transcendence and significance to human life.
I'm going to cut this off here because the point of this is not to respond to every minute of his video. But one of the things that really struck me here is this so-called awe problem. And all I can say to that is this. Have you ever watched any of the old videos of Carl Sagan? Now, I know for you youngins out there, the idea of Carl Sagan, he's been dead for a while. So even the idea of Carl Sagan is getting a little long in the tooth. But if you ever want to experience the kind of awe that you can have while not believing in any gods whatsoever, just hear that man talk. He's not the only one, okay? I'm not saying that, well, he's the one guy who's the happy atheist with a sense of awe, but I think that he is a great example of how you can be filled with awe and not believe in a single God. And I'm not going to go through all 4 of his points here, but the idea that you have to have gods in your life to make this happen is fallacious. And I'll say it again. The first question, the only question that really matters when considering these issues in the first place is, do you honestly believe in God or gods? If you believe that there is a God up there, I'm not here to shout you down. And if you believe that there is a God there, and maybe your Christianity isn't doing it for you, then maybe you should look for another religion. If you believe there's a God up there and you have drifted away from your Christianity and you're not in a good state, maybe you should try to go back to Christianity. Yes, this is an atheist telling you this because I can't make you not believe in God, nor would I want to. You can't make me believe in God. And trust me, you don't want to even try. So the first question you have to be honest with yourself about is, do I even believe that the magic sky daddy is up there? If you believe that, then by all means, try to do everything you can to embrace some kind of theistic understanding that brings you happiness. But if you don't believe it already, then there is no set of arguments you can give me for happiness that are going to make me believe in your God. Like, you can't tell me, well, you don't believe in God, Adam, but you look really miserable today. So maybe you should decide to believe in God today because that will make you happy. That doesn't work. The brain doesn't work that way. So it's a false dichotomy to think about this problem of what happens without God. You either believe in the God or you don't. But again, I think Gavin understands this. A presentation like this, whether he wants to admit it or not, is really more about speaking subconsciously to any of the Christians in your audience who have doubts, especially like unvoiced, unrealized doubts. And they're not sure if they should do anything with them or if they're not sure if they should just keep getting along to get along. And this is a not so subtle way of telling people that if you don't shut those doubts up, see, you're going to be miserable. Your life will be unlivable. So you need to shove them way down inside. You need to do everything you can to stop those doubts up. Because if you don't, your life will be devastating and your life will be unlivable. So that was why I wanted to address this. I think that as apologists go, Gavin is one of the more thoughtful, open-minded, and well-spoken people I've found on the web, which again is why I found this presentation to be more disappointing, because it felt like really strawmanning a lot of atheism, talking about atheism as though it's nihilism when it's not, talking about these things like you have almost like there's a choice of, well, what would you do without God? Well, I already don't believe in God, so that's a moot point. I don't have an option in my brain to just turn on the belief and suddenly say, fine, I believe in God now. So some of these questions are moot from the start. Some of his analogies, as I pointed out, are laughable to me because it's like, wow, you're just looking for structure. And if you want structure, that's fine. And if you feel that your God gives you structure, that's fine. But this isn't the way to make that argument. Anyway, I'm glad that you've been with me. Thank you for the view. I hope to see you on many more videos. But until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.